I was trapped in the lair of a madman. And I came out wearing somebody else's skin. Part 1. It all started 2 years ago. I just quit being a waitress at our local diner. Our boss was a complete dick, you know the type. Big sleazeball who doesn't shower. Somehow he always had grease on him. But I never saw him cook. Anyways, I was done with his sexual advances and stealing all my tips. So I up and left. I lived paycheck to paycheck. My bank account didn't have enough to cover my rent. So as soon as I got home I started searching for another job. I know. Probably not the smartest thing to quit a job without another one lined up. But the thought of another pinch on my ass made me want to puke. A couple of days before I faced eviction, I lucked into a new gig delivering groceries. At the time, I thought I had a guardian angel looking out for me. In hindsight, it might have been something else. I delivered groceries to a small range of people. Most were elderly or disabled. But there were some who had the money or were plain lazy. I pulled up to the last house of the day. My nerves were fading. And I felt I was getting into the swing of things. Things were working out. As I walked up to the door, I took a good look at the place. I enjoyed seeing the diversity in people's houses and lives. This one seemed to be in mild disrepair. The grass looked like it hadn't been mown in weeks, which matched the nearby trees whose branches were so long they reached the ground. The house was badly in need of a new paint job. The front porch had a couple of loose boards here and there that groaned as I stepped on them. I rang the doorbell and was greeted by a middle-aged balding man in a wheelchair. His eyes flicked over me in an appraising manner. Then he smiled at me as he observed, "Ah, to be young and able? I miss those days. Don't ever take your youth for granted, young lady." I politely smiled at his statement and began to place the boxes on the ground in front of the door. "If you wouldn't mind," he interrupted, "just hand them to me so I can put them away. It's rather hard for me to pick them up off the ground." I winced, realizing my mistake, and handed them to him. His kind eyes twinkled at me. I could tell I wasn't the first person to do that. After giving him the first round, I turned to head back to my truck to grab the next batch. He had bought enough food to feed a family, though only my car was parked in his driveway. As I was picking up the next box from my truck, I heard him mutter, "Oh dear heavens. Not again." When I turned around, I could immediately tell what the problem was. His power had gone out. As I handed him the next round of food, he looked at me with what I could only describe as middle-aged puppy eyes. "I think I tripped a circuit breaker," he explained. "Gosh darn thing has been misbehaving for a while now. Could I bother you to go down into the basement to reset it? I don't want to impose, but I can't really make it down those stairs myself. It'd take ages for the sheriff or electric company to come help me out. I'm sure if I actually watched the training videos, instead of just fast-forwarding through them and checking the boxes, they would have told me to never enter a stranger's house, let alone their basement. I'd also like to believe that my mother taught me to be more cautious. But he just seemed so helpless. "If you help me out, I'll let you have some of the ice cream you saved," he pleaded. I chuckled, and against my better judgment crossed his threshold. "All right, I'll do it for the ice cream. Besides, you're my last stop of the day, so I have some time." "Bless you," he said. "It will only take a second. The basement's just over here." He dropped off his groceries on the counter and wheeled himself further into the house. I followed him to a door which led downstairs. Since the basement was pitch black, I pulled out my phone and turned on its flashlight. I remember my childhood fear of the basement seeping into me, the trepidation and belief that monsters and evil lived beneath our house. The idea grew silly as I aged, but it resurfaced in that man's house. His words shook me out of my thoughts. "Once you reach the bottom of the stairs, turn right. You'll find the circuit breaker on the far wall." I nodded and ventured into the basement. I found the circuit breaker no problem. Sure enough, a couple of switches had been thrown. I flipped them back to normal, and heard a whir accompanied by lights. At that same time, I heard the basement door close. My heart froze, and as soon as my brain caught up, I found myself sprinting back up the stairs. The doorknob turned easily, but the door wouldn't open. I remember wondering to myself how he managed to block the door in his wheelchair. I desperately threw myself against it to no avail. When I paused, I began to hear a voice from downstairs. I cautiously crept down to the edge of the stairs to better listen. "Hey, there's somebody else here, isn't there?" It said, "Listen to me. You need to get out. Leave while you still can." I edged closer to the voice, hoping they could help me out. "I can't," I called out. "The door's blocked. Though, if we work together, we might be able to break it down." "Oh duck. It's too late." It wept. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. There's nothing I see." The voice abruptly stopped. "Hey, are you alright? What happened?" I asked. In response, I heard a lock click open. Suddenly, the door to the room where I heard the voice burst open. A man was standing in the doorway with a wooden baseball bat. He seemed slightly younger than me, though his body was emaciated, and his brown hair was long and unkempt. He wore a dirty pair of ripped jeans and a ragged torn t-shirt. He looked at me hungrily, then started walking towards me slowly, dragging the bat along the ground. "Help me," I called out to the voice. "There's somebody here." The man laughed. "Nobody's coming to help you, sweetie." His voice matched the one I heard earlier. I backed away, but he continued his slow march towards me. I looked around, searching for anything that could help. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him move. He picked up the bat and ran towards me. As he swung, I dropped to the floor, barely avoiding the impact. He tripped over me and I scrambled back to my feet. When I fell, I landed on something in my pocket and remembered the pepper spray I attached to my keys. I struggled to pull it out as he stood up and picked up the bat. Once he was close enough, I sprayed it into his face. Instantly, my world flipped upside down. Everything was wrong. My face burned like hell. I was blinded, and something was spraying into my eyes. I dropped the pepper spray, only it was far heavier than I remembered, making a thud as it landed on the floor. I scrambled away from the intruder, one hand trying to stop the continuing spray, the other wiping it from my face. Did he also have pepper spray? I remember thinking, how could that be? I clearly saw him holding a bat, and nothing else. In my blind stupor I tripped, the floor not being quite where I expected it. And I fell a lot harder than usual. My bruise didn't hurt from landing on the pepper spray before, but I had aches and pains in bizarre places. One thought raced through my head more than any other. What the hell is happening? I tried to push it aside to face my attacker. But since I was blind and disoriented, my only course of action was to try to clear my eyes. I forced them open long enough to see my attacker picking up the baseball bat from the ground. Though they didn't look quite right, they seemed a lot smaller. At the time I thought that was just because my vision was blurry. But then I heard a voice. "Ha. Didn't expect that. Did you?" It chucked to itself. They never do. The voice. It was mine. I panicked and started screaming. My own voice was foreign to me. I lashed and thrashed out with limbs that seemed too long and gangly. Mostly I just hit the floor. That was all I could manage before I felt the bat smashing into my body. He, or was it she now, assaulted me multiple times. I raised my forearms to prevent the blows, but that caused the bat to smash into the bone, causing even more pain. I curled into a ball, resigning myself to the blows. There wasn't anything I could do, and nothing made sense. That's when I felt them grab my legs and force them apart. The last thing I remember is feeling a swift kick to my groin, and a pain unlike anything I had ever felt before. I blacked out. When I came to, the first thing I remember was the pain. It was enough to dispel any notion of the previous events being a dream or, more accurately, a nightmare. Every inch of me radiated pain. I was one giant bruise, though surprisingly nothing seemed broken. My groin was the worst. It was unbearable and protested whenever I shifted. "I guess you're finally awake," a voice observed. I couldn't place it until I turned my head and saw the man in the wheelchair. He sat next to my bed. I should have recognized the voice, but the way he spoke was so different than when I first encountered him. I looked around at the rest of my room. I was lying in a bed, but an old and ratty one at that. Next to me was a folding tray table with some water, bloody bandages, and other first aid items I couldn't immediately discern. The room had seen better days. The wallpaper looked like it was from the 50s and was peeling in some places. The rug was stained. A musty smell permeated throughout. "How am I alive?" I ventured. "He was playing with you. Killing is more of a last resort for him," he answered. You locked me in there with him. I accused. I told you to run. He quipped. Deadpan. I couldn't believe he thought this was a joke. But as I said before, I really am sorry. You don't deserve this. Nobody does. Then let me go. I pleaded. I won't tell anybody what happened. I swear. Besides, I really need this job, and the last thing I would want is to stir up trouble on my first day. I'm sorry. But I'm just as helpless as you. If I could, I would free us both. He seemed sincere as he looked kindly upon me. Trust me. I want to. Still, I didn't believe him. What do you mean you're helpless? Just because you can't walk? The anger built up inside of me. You didn't have to force me into the basement with him. Then I realized what he said. And you're a liar. You never told me to run. In fact, you're the one who got me in this whole mess in the first place. Ah. Yeah. I remember how hard it was for me when I first got here. Let's see. How can I break it to you gently? He muttered to himself under his breath. Then he turned to me. Well, to start, I'm not who you think I am. As far as identity matters in this house. He wasn't making any sense. What do you mean? I'm not the same person who you first met when you came in. In fact, I didn't actually see you until you were already knocked out. That guy. He's the other person who lives here. And he's the one who will make the rest of our lives a living hell. Okay. If we didn't meet, then who the hell are you? I asked. Rather skeptically. His identical twin. Except he's the evil one. I'm the voice you heard when you first got to the basement. I tried to warn you. But I didn't know you were even here until I saw the power come back on. I knew he couldn't have done it himself because he was in the wheelchair. And I was still locked up. Wait. But if you were in the basement, and the voice I heard, then you're the one who beat me into this pulp. I exclaimed. I tried sitting up as I said that. But the effort hurt too much and I fell back down onto the bed. Yeah, no. He winced in sympathy. This is where it gets harder to explain. However, you are now one of the 3 people in the world who would actually believe what I'm about to say. Horror planted itself inside of me. It started as a pit in my stomach and slowly spread to freeze the rest of my body as I waited for his next words. He can swap bodies with anybody in his grasp. I know it sounds ridiculous. But you're currently in mine. And I'm currently in his. Or at least the body he had when I first got here. I wanted to reject his words. I wanted more than anything to stay in denial. I mean, humans can't do that. Right? But too many things started to add up. Why my chin was so scratchy. Why my clothes were all different. The pepper spray. And the fact that I saw myself right before I got attacked. Besides, all I had to do was look at my hand and I could tell it wasn't mine. What the hell? That's I stammered. Searching for some way to express the indignity I felt. Illegal. I finally spat out. Pathetically. He chuckled. I understand that shock is a very real thing. But you have to understand how ridiculous what you just said was. In this house, the law does not apply. But I was just kidnapped and beaten within an inch of my life. Any sane cop would arrest him. Yes. But first they would have to catch him. Nobody has ever set foot in this house that he didn't explicitly invite in. That's preposterous. As soon as people notice I've gone missing, they'll start to look. And the first place they'd check would be the delivery company. They definitely have a record of my route, and so eventually a detective will come knocking on this door. Sure. But that relies on people knowing you're missing. What do you mean by that? As soon as I don't show up for work the next day, questions will be asked. It's not like he can return my van and quit for me. Can he? He stared at me like a teacher scolding a school child. I realized the error in what I said. Oh. I sighed. He can. He is my body duck. Silence followed as my brain processed the situation I found myself in. I took another look around the room. It certainly was a depressing prison. One which reminded me of my dying grandmother's house. There, everything fell apart because she had grown too old to keep up with the maintenance. Here, the disuse seemed to stem from more of a carelessness. The house felt like more of a tool and less of a home. As I looked around, I noticed the locks. What seemed like every portal to the outside world was locked by a combination locked doors. Windows. You name it. He must have hidden them when he lured me inside. Or maybe I wasn't looking too closely. Everything happened so fast anyways. Besides, I wasn't in any situation to be going anywhere. I passed the rest of the time asking my cellmate questions. I had a difficult time coming to grips with my new reality. So I ventured. How does he do it? Do what? He responded. Swap bodies. I have no idea. Though I have a couple of theories. Wait. Really? I blurted. Haha. Yes. But they're more products of an overactive imagination than anything else. Maybe he's an alien. Or a hypnotist. Have you ever read any of those comic books? He could be straight out of one of those. You know. Like a mutant or something. I stared at him. Slightly unnerved that he could be so casual about this. Well, he started. Seeing my shocked face. Those are more of the absurd ones. I also have thought this whole thing was just a drug-fueled hallucination. If it is, then those must be some strong drugs. Because I'm here too. I quipped. Sardonically at that. Exactly what my subconscious would say to convince me everything was real. He laughed. Despite myself. His comment elicited a chuckle. Then there's the scariest idea of them all. His face darkened slightly. What if he isn't anything special? What if everybody can do that? And he's just the only one who's figured it out. There was a period of time here where I convinced myself that was the truth. It was the only thing that kept me sane for a bit. The idea that I could get my revenge by switching with him. I got over that idea after I almost passed out by trying so hard to switch bodies. The thought scared me. What if everybody really had this power? Would we be able to prevent ourselves from abusing it like he could? Or is this humanity's destiny? I shook myself from that idea. My cellmate had been here too long, he must be going delirious. Say, how long have you been here anyways? I asked. Too long. It feels like my entire life. Though I don't think it could have been more than a couple of years. I don't know. It's hard to keep track of time in here. There are some days when I don't see the sun at all. And sleep schedules take on a whole other meaning here. He scratched the back of his head. Obviously wanting to move away from the subject. Listen. He began in an attempt to segue away. If you're going to survive in here, there's a couple of things you should know. 1. From here on out we share bodies. Whatever hurts you will eventually be hurting me. I swallowed. I'm already not looking forward to hopping back into my old body after what he did to it. Granted, the old man's isn't that great of a body to inhabit either. As if on cue he started a coughing fit. See? He wiped some spittle away. He doesn't really take good care of it. And as far as I can tell, he doesn't really believe in doctors. Not when he can switch to a younger, healthier body. Speaking of younger, healthier bodies. He just latched onto yours. So we have a little bit of time. What do you mean latched onto mine? I interjected. What's he doing to my body? You'll find out soon enough. Don't worry. It shouldn't be harmed. We've got more important things to talk about right now. This conversation, right here, is not normal. There's very few times we'll be able to talk without him regularly checking up on us. It can drive you mad never knowing if you're talking to me. Or to him. Almost happened to me before you got here. So I came up with a signal so you know it's me. How good is your memory? I stammered. I'm no genius. But I'm decent at remembering things. Good enough. I'm going to hold up a number on my fingers. Memorize it. If you're going to say something to me, then you'll throw up a number on your fingers. And I'll subtract that from my number and hold those fingers up. Then you'll set up the new password before talking. Let's do an example. He held up all 5 fingers. Now pick any number between 0 to 5 and hold those up. I help up 3 fingers. Like this? Yup. And to complete it I'll hold up 2 fingers. He did so. Since 2 plus 3 is 5, you know it's me. Now since I confirmed my identity, you can say what you want. Then you get to set the new password. I held up 4 fingers. And he nodded. I basked in his approval. He seemed genuinely excited about it. Though, after thinking it over a little, I could see a problem with this system. What if he figures it out? Or what if he accidentally sets a new password? I asked. I had no idea what I was doing and I just completed the signal. Can't he start the signal by accident and then set a password that only one of us will know? Crap. He exhaled. Dejected. I've thought about that signal for forever but missed that. Let's say for a password reset you put your hand like this. He made his hand into a fist, but with his thumb between his middle and ring finger. Then ask a question where a number can be the answer. It might not be the best system, but it's certainly better than nothing. He shrugged. I guess. I was happy that I contributed to his system. I was starting to understand the reality of my situation. You said he does regular checkups. Like to check on our health? I asked. Oh no. He cares about our health so long as we don't die. Again. We're pretty disposable to him. His checkups are more to ensure we aren't trying to hurt ourselves, trying to escape, or trying to hurt him in any way. That's how he asserts power over us. Well, if he's not listening now, shouldn't we be trying to do something? Like run away? Or hurt him? You shouldn't get out of bed. You're probably still in shock or something. Running off pure adrenaline. With those words, the aches and pains from the earlier fight made themselves known to me again. I groaned and rubbed them, trying to make them go away. See? He pointed out. Besides, even if you could move, we're locked in. Unless you can pick locks. I can't think of a way to get out of here without alerting him that we're escaping. I also can't think of any good way to hurt him that I haven't already tried. Do you have any ideas? I sat for a moment trying to think. But my mind just went in circles around my current predicament. I only had access to this small room, had barely interacted with my captor, and couldn't even sit up properly. No. I finally admitted. You aren't feeling suicidal or anything, are you? What? No. I exclaimed. Why would you even ask that? That's what I thought. I'm not either. But that's because I'm still clinging to the hope that I can take that bastard out. I just thought I would mention it. Since now would be the time to off yourself if you wanted to. I awkwardly chuckled. Before I realized that he wasn't kidding. What could bring someone to so casually bring up suicide to a stranger? Despite the injuries from the prior day, I managed to catch a little sleep. I had a lot to think about. Conveniently, I had more than enough time to do so. The minutes passed into hours. And then the hours seemed to drag on and on as well. My cellmate brought me water from somewhere in the room and coaxed out some food as well. Soon, Mother Nature called. When I asked him to go to the bathroom, he sheepishly smiled and produced a bucket from the corner. To my horror, he handed it to me and turned his back, realizing I had no other option. I forced my way out of bed, which was quite the endeavor in and of itself, mind you, removed my pants and began to squat over the bucket. I made quite the mess, relieving myself until I got a handle on my new body and its newfound genitalia. By God, it was so unwieldy. How did men ever manage to control the gosh darn thing? After that embarrassing experience, I returned to the bed, hitting different body parts on the furniture along the way as I acclimated to this foreign body. As the time passed, I thought I would never leave that room, and began to doubt everything my cellmate had told me. Maybe he really was my captor this whole time. Eventually, I begged for a distraction. Unfortunately, my wish came true. 1 second. I was staring at, well, I don't know if I could call him my friend just yet, and the next I saw nothing. My aches from earlier were abruptly replaced by exhaustion, fatigue, and a muted sense of euphoria. Everything felt so alien and disturbing. But at the same time there was something familiar lingering in the background. I gasped, struggling to draw in enough breath. No matter how hard I tried, it seemed like I couldn't get enough oxygen in me. And I was surprisingly wet. My soft, warm cot was suddenly hard and cold. I thought I was having a stroke and went to call out for help. The effort slammed my face further into the floor and I realized I was lying on my stomach. With a serious effort I turned myself over, still panting, and took in my surroundings. The room around me had changed. For one, it was darker than it was a second ago. More importantly, my cellmate was gone. I was alone. The old, faded wallpaper was replaced with bare cinderblock walls, and the carpet was now a simple, cold concrete. There were no windows here. The only light came from a bare bulb hanging from a wire in the ceiling. The furniture was equally sparse. I saw a bare mattress on the floor, a plastic set of drawers next to the mattress, a full-length mirror propped up against the wall, some folding chairs and a folding table. There was also a set of free weights and a bench to go with them. A rope hung from the ceiling, and my mind flashed back to my cellmate's question about suicide. Though I guess we didn't share a cell anymore. I could barely move. I was so tired. My body felt weirdly stretched out, like I had just gone through some rigorous training course. Every inch of me was drenched with sweat. Slowly I clawed my way back to my senses and sat up. I glanced down to get my first good look at myself and noticed a couple of things. For one, I was back in my body. Any joy I might have felt at that reunion was ruined by what else I saw as I examined myself. All along my body were cuts, varying from paper cuts to somewhat serious gashes. They all stung as the salt from my sweat entered the open wounds. Where there weren't cuts, there were burn marks. I could see these because I was entirely naked. Puke forced its way out of my throat as I realized what happened. Like lightning, I suddenly understood why my entire body was so sore. Shock gripped my body, which soon gave way to outrage. I was violated. I screamed until my throat was raw, my imagination catching up to the contents of the room. The drawers loomed worst in my mind. I was terrified to discover its contents, but just had to know what was in there. My curiosity won out, and I rummaged through the drawers. Inside I found a first aid kit, thankfully containing bandages, which I used to dress my wounds. I also found a pocket knife, a large battery with wires and clamps, a mostly empty matchbook, and a hand mirror. I also found no clothes in that room. The mattress did not even include a blanket. So, I sat on the grimy thing, naked and fuming. A rancid smell began to overtake my nose. I went to investigate and found a bucket tucked next to the mattress, filled with what I can only hope was my own refuse. Thoroughly worn out, and despite the hideous room and the hours of sleep in the other body, I was soon unconscious. I don't even remember my head hitting the floor. I woke with a killer headache. I briefly considered that everything had been a weird fever dream, and that I was lying on the floor of Christina's room. I opened my eyes to the bare light bulb, and it felt like the naked light was drilling a hole into my brain. Slowly, the memories of my 21st melted off my mind. But hell, if this isn't some sort of hangover. I thought I was so tired because of the exhaustion. But could I have been drugged too? He'd already done who knows what to my body. It wasn't hard to imagine he'd filled it with drugs as well. Any sense of outrage was numbed for the time being. Swamped by an emotional storm, I had to get out. Maybe he thinks I'm still sleeping. It was hard to tell. My headache made it difficult to think straight. I got up and paced the room. If I could get out, maybe I could make it to the front door before he knew I was here. I had to be in the basement. The cinder block walls made no sense anywhere else in his house. That meant I was in the room where my attacker came out the night before. And right next to the stairs. 3 doors, presumably locked, were all that stood between me and freedom. I walked over to the door of my new room and tried it. The doorknob turned just fine, but the door itself would not budge. Okay. So definitely locked. I kicked myself for being dumb. There was a padlock hanging from the bolt. Gosh. My headache was killing me. But I was alone and had a chance. I looked over the bolt, trying to see if I could remove the latch mechanism from the door. Damn. He nailed it in. Not going to be as easy as unscrewing it. I sat there thinking, as painfully as it was, until I remembered the knife in the drawer. I brought it out and started to see if I could pry the nails out. I slipped the edge of the knife under a nail, but couldn't get enough leverage to start prying. I braced an elbow against the door and tried again. The knife slipped and I fell against the door, making a loud rattling sound. Immediately everything switched. I was sitting down, and felt gross. In front of me was my attacker from before, well, the body of the younger man at least. I gave him a quizzical look and held up 3 fingers. He raised one back to me, then reset the password to be 6. I think you pissed him off, he stated. I gulped. Why do you say that? Gosh. Even the old man's mouth felt disgusting. The teeth weren't very well aligned, and I nipped my tongue while talking. He switched out mid-sentence, and left you here gaping at me. He doesn't like being cut off like that. What was that sound? I tripped. That was a loud sound for just tripping. Can we not talk about it? I'm kinda dealing with a lot right now. He raised his hand palm up in a suit yourself gesture. I tried to stand, and my legs refused to cooperate, only barely responding to my effort. I almost fell out of the wheelchair but caught myself at the last moment. A scream escaped my lips, and I embraced it, putting a little more force behind my expression of frustration. I punched myself in my apparently crippled legs and felt only a numb pain in response. I glared at my cellmate. For some reason I blamed him for my predicament. "If only you," I spat out, trying to vent my anger. Before I could finish the sentence, everything changed again with a sickening lurch. I could feel my legs again. And holy shit, they hurt. I was standing facing away from the door, and I fell to the floor disoriented. I grabbed my right thigh in an effort to stop the pain. My hand touched something wet and sticky. In horror, I looked down and noticed the blood. My leg was bleeding rather badly. I lifted my hand to get a better look at the wound and recoiled in disgust. Bad. The word was crudely carved into my flesh. In a flash I remembered the bandages I used earlier and half crawled my way back to the plastic drawers. When I opened them, the first aid kit was missing. I glanced around the room and saw no obvious hiding place for them. I reached for my arm to remove a bandage I applied earlier, only to find it was missing as well. Shit. This hurts like hell. Thinking about removing my old bandages and the new gouges in my skin reminded me of the knife I was trying to use to escape. Another glance around the room showed he must have taken the knife as well. Damn. He really thinks of everything. Not knowing what else to do, I slumped against a wall and tried to keep pressure on my leg to stop the bleeding. In that moment of despair, I broke down and wept. I was defeated and was starting to understand how depraved this madman really was. Any illusions of the well-meaning man who promised me ice cream disappeared, and instead I was left with this omniscient ghost hovering over me. My nerves got to me and I felt extremely nauseous. I scrambled to the refuse pail before dry heaving the non-existent contents of my stomach. I couldn't even throw up properly. Luckily by that point my bleeding had stopped. Thank God. But I was too weak from the blood loss to try anything else. Eventually, I switched back into the wheelchair body, though this time the room was empty. The lack of feeling in my legs was a welcome break for a change. I'm a bit ashamed about it now, but I sat there feeling so grateful for that respite that I didn't even try the door or search the room. It ended too quickly anyways. I found myself back in my body, retaining the warmth from the wheelchair body. Worried my legs didn't work either. I kicked one and heard a faint crinkle. I was laying on the mattress, with my legs slightly elevated on top of a pillow. A thin metallic blanket, one of those emergency blankets I'd used camping, lay draped over my body. It was a small dignity, considering he did not return my clothes. When I reached to touch the wound, there was a fresh bandage there. Creepy. Slowly, and with a lack of willpower to do anything else, I nodded off. I lived in squalor in that sparse room for the next few weeks. Or what I assume were weeks. I didn't have any sort of clock to base things off. I would alternate between the old man's body and my own. When I was in the old man's body, sometimes I would be with my cellmate. But more often than not I was alone. Alone. But never unsupervised. I didn't realize how much liberty I had in that first day. After my escape attempt, my reality started flickering. At random moments, I would feel a split second of disorientation. My surroundings would change. I would get a strange taste in my mouth, and my body twitched. At first I thought I was hallucinating. Something caused by stress or the beating I took. Eventually, in one of these flickers, I caught a glimpse of the old man and realized what was happening. He was checking in. Every couple of minutes we'd switch places. These swaps were always unexpected and so quick that I spent them trying to recover my balance. I can only assume that he used them to make sure I was behaving. God. He was despicable. I dealt with so many controlling men in my life. And this new job was supposed to be a fresh start from everything. Instead, I was a puppet, only allowed autonomy when my puppet master was bored of playing with my body. Left with the chores of maintaining my own health. At the very least I never had to directly witness what he did to me. Only guess based on the aftermath. I tried to keep those thoughts and questions out of my head. They could only cause more grief than I had to spare. Eventually he must have gotten bored playing with my regular body because then he started experimenting. In the beginning of my imprisonment, I tried to count the days by the cycle of food and sleep. I gave up once I realized how irregular everything was. There were periods where I never saw any food. He could keep me on the brink of starving to death. swapping me out to just a slightly less hungry body and depriving me of the joy of finally eating. My mouth would be constantly dry as well. Having just been unemployed, I didn't think my body had much weight to lose. That was my first lesson. There was always something to lose. Slowly, I watched my already thin body slough off weight until only an emaciated husk stared back at me in my mirror. I stopped looking in it after that. I'd never truly experienced starvation until that point. Even when I was absolutely broke and spacing out one meal to last a whole day while I begged for another job, I at least had some food. I desperately wished that I could go back to when I'm starving meant I'd only gone more than 3 hours without a snack. I tried to keep my mind off of the food, but there wasn't much to occupy my thoughts. In the beginning I paced around the room and tried to do exercises. Fatigue and sleep were better than the constant hunger. Try as I might, I could never really sleep on my own. Either I'd be swapped into an exhausted body and sleep would shortly follow, or I lay motionless for hours trying to fall unconscious. Soon, I didn't have the energy to continue with exercises, and I was stuck waiting for that blissful swap of sleep. I started hallucinating, thinking a piece of dust was a leftover crumb, or that bugs were crawling over my body. What few dreams I had escalated those illusions. It got to the point where I could only tell that I was awake by the pain in my stomach. Eventually, I was so weak that just sitting up exhausted me. At that point, I had given up on any sense of cleanliness. I simply pissed and shat where I lay, while silently praying for death. Instead, I got a granola bar. I switched back to find it lying on my chest. At first, I ignored it, convinced it was another one of my hallucinations. He must have placed a brick on my chest, I told myself. Only when I heard the crinkle of the wrapper, a sound I thought I had long forgotten, I decided to risk my reality. I tore into it and was shocked to find it real. Part of me thought that I was becoming even more delusional, while the rest of me licked the crumbs off the wretched floor. The sensation of chewing real food felt foreign to me. I had never been so happy before in my life. Slowly the amount of food fed to me increased. At first I was grateful, as my shrunken stomach couldn't handle much food. I ended up puking much of it back out, but no longer felt starved. The weight I lost came back. I started checking the mirror again, and every time I looked I seemed more like my old self. My eyes were still sunken, and I was covered in sores from my days spent motionless. But at least I no longer looked like a skeleton barely covered by skin. As would become routine, my happiness slowly melted to horror. The amount of food didn't stop increasing. I felt like I was always eating. Every time I switched bodies there was more food in front of me. Though now my cellmate's body was added to the rotation, I only stayed in the other bodies long enough to finish the meal, and then I'd be shunted back into my own. If I didn't eat the food put in front of me, I would be punished. My body was constantly lined with cuts, bruises, and burns, though my face was surprisingly kept free of any blemishes. I forced myself to feed when asked, no matter how painful. My vomiting continued as well, though it was due to overindulging rather than a sickly stomach. But I continued to shove food down my gullet, as anything was better than more broken fingers or toes. My eating became mechanical. I barely tasted what I was putting in my mouth. This too was a godsend, since some of what I ate looked disgusting. I had rotten fish and moldy bread sandwiches, disgusting blends of food and other slop. Meat no longer looked like well-made patties, instead becoming intestines and other entrails that I ate raw. But I did as I was told. The weight didn't stop either. My body continued to fatten. Eventually my ribs were hidden by rolls of flesh, and I stopped looking in the mirror once more. My body wasn't mine anyways, and I did not want to see what it had become. I hated that room. I hated the old man. I hated everything. But I kept myself contained. I had enough carvings on my body to know the consequences of lashing out. Insults joined my scars. Words such as pig, slut, whore, wimp were branded into my skin. Some scars were self-inflicted though, thinking I could take back my body by cutting off the excess weight. When I looked at those I cursed myself for being a fool. But they gradually faded into the other marks, losing their individuality as well. I returned to the point where I did not care about the pain. I only craved death. But as before, that would not come. Despite how much of me he broke and hurt, he still kept me fed. He kept me alive. More than anything, I craved social interaction. We aren't built to be alone. If hell is other people, then solitude is purgatory. Personally, I'd prefer the closure of hell over the constant wandering of purgatory. I cherished the few moments shared with my cellmate. I would find myself blathering to him about my life and worries. He mainly talked about our captor. He always had some piece of advice that helped whatever torture I was currently enduring, as well as his latest theory on the old man. It was reassuring to know somebody else was sharing similar experiences with me, that I wasn't alone. I knew the man for a shorter period of time than most of my regular customers back when I worked at the diner. Despite that, I counted him amongst my closest friends. I don't know whether we'd have ever hung out outside of that place, but part of me would like to think that we could have met up for drinks in another universe. When I was left alone, I fell into a black depression. Little mattered, and days flitted past uncounted. That is, until the day I found myself sitting at an elaborate table set for three. I'd grown so used to living in squalor that seeing proper dishware gave me a weird nostalgic shock. While not fine china by any means, the plates all matched and were intact. Ahead of me lay a spread of crackers, cheese, and grapes. What surprised me most was how clean everything was. The tablecloth was mildly stained and torn, but I could tell it had been freshly laundered. With a start, I realized even I had been freshly showered. And my clothes had been cleaned too. I heard a chair squeak and looked up to see that the table setting was no accident. The younger man seated himself, and I noticed that the older, wheelchair-bound man had already joined us. All three inhabitants were in the same room for the first time since I entered this house. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you again," the younger man said. I glanced to the older man with a questioning look, and he shook his head in response. I was so overwhelmed I had no idea how to even respond. I just sat there staring at him. "It's been so long. And you've been as obedient as could be expected." I felt a reward was in order. I must confess, Benedict over there did most of the work. He gestured at the spread of food and tea in front of him. "But it was all my idea." "Benedict?" I asked, looking back and forth between the two men. "Yes, Benedict," he said, pointing to the older man. "Ah. He didn't tell you. TSK. And here I thought I'd have taught you your manners by now." Earlier, there had never been any need for names, considering he was the only other person I interacted with. Yet I was surprised, both at never asking, and also because, "Benedict." "Ha," I started, making a half-hearted chuckle. "You don't look much like a Benedict." It was true. He always had a rough around the edges type personality, though maybe I was still biased after my first impression. That was when his body beat me to a pulp with a baseball bat. He looked at me and shrugged, not trying to even make a joke about his name. Instead, the old man returned my chuckle. "Well," the young man cut in, "I guess I don't quite have the knack for naming yet. But no matter. I'm sure Benedict will live up to the name regardless." Now on to the next question. "What should I call you?" I open my mouth to speak, but he cuts me off before any words can come out. "Oh hush. I don't care what you were called before you entered here. You've been reborn, my dear. And though you are but an infant, you shall grow into a fine woman, one worthy of the name I shall bestow." He seemed to be reciting the words, as if they were a well-worn mantra. I felt they were more meant for him than for me. Regardless, I remained quiet. I didn't know how to act while actually in his presence. "Aha! I've got it. From henceforth, you shall be known as Margaret." As with Benedict, I didn't feel Margaret suited me at all. It seemed too formal, more a fit for the tea party I saw before me than the woman I remembered in the mirror. Benedict and I remained silent after the pronouncement. The younger man did not seem to notice, and instead poured himself a cup of tea and alternated between sipping it and taking small bites out of a pastry he picked up. Several minutes passed with the only sounds being the sips, clinks, and crunches of the young man eating. He delicately patted his mouth with a napkin, then looked up. "Go on," he said, with an impatient gesture. "I went through all this trouble for you. The least you could do is enjoy it." I reached over to pick up the teapot. Annoyance briefly flashed over the younger man's face as I poured myself a cup. Droplets splashed out and landed on the tablecloth, staining it. "Is this your first tea party?" The man looked like a gracious host, giddy to show his guest a new treat. I nodded, I'm more of a coffee person. He chuckled. Well, let me give you a few tips then. First, it is polite to lift your pinky finger when sipping. Like so. He demonstrated. You should always take small sips. And never slurp. Moderation was always the British way. It will allow you to fully experience the delight of tea. The same goes for the rest of the dainties. There is plenty of food here and I do not wish to see you spoil your first time with overindulgence. That last phrase was like iron. It wasn't hard to imagine the implied threat. I nodded again. Afraid to make any sudden moves that would offend him. That's enough to get you started. Don't fret. We can go more into detail about proper etiquette later. For now, enjoy. He stared at me intently as I brought the cup up to my lips and took a sip. As soon as the liquid hit my tongue, I felt a disorienting flicker. Please forgive me, the younger man said, not looking the least bit embarrassed. I couldn't restrain myself. I wanted to feel what it felt like the first time. The rest of the meal continued similarly. I would take a bite or sip and immediately a flicker would follow. The young man seemed to be enjoying the meal much more than I was. There were times he sighed after I would eat. He didn't eat anything else after I had started. Now that I think about it, Benedict didn't partake at all in that first tea party either. After a while the young man stopped me. It wouldn't do to inundate you so quickly. This was fun. We shall do it again. I'll show you to our room. Now. He stood up and bid me to follow. Which I did. He led me away from the basement room I had spent the past few months in. And led me upstairs. To a bedroom that looked similar to the one I first woke up in. He bid me adieu. Literally. So I took some time to reflect on what just happened. The dinner was so different from my past time here. I just didn't know what to think. Everything had seemed so dreamlike that I didn't even bother trying to get a better view of the house as I was led upstairs. For a man who kept me in constant misery while I had been living here. He seemed so civil. That was what off-put me the most. Nothing he said felt genuine. He was putting up a facade. And I was left wondering why. He broke my routine. Instead of only jumping into different bodies for meals and sleep, I would jump into a new one to find myself facing my captor again. At first, the jumps brought me joy. I remembered those rare instances of alone time with my cellmate or Benedict as I now knew. Each time I'd try to strike up a conversation only for him to act amused. Only when he didn't respond did I know I'd mistaken the person in front of me. He stuck to his word for those first sessions. He taught me proper tea conduct. He adjusted my posture. And I had to relearn my manners. Apparently, everything I thought I knew wrong. It was beyond frustrating. Which he made even worse by constant flickering. He'd know if I ever slouched or wasn't keeping my feet in the proper position. At times he made me hold these positions for hours. If I messed up, he'd scold me. I learned he was impatient if I messed up too many times or didn't catch on quickly enough. He would inflict more pain. Sometimes this was verbal abuse. But more often than not it was physical. I found myself wishing those punishments were simple beatings. Those at least were quick. His other punishments weren't. Sometimes I'd be shunted into a box or closet of some sorts. One that was too short to comfortably stand but too narrow to sit in. So I had to assume a weird crouch lean. Other times he would take away my bed and other comforts, then leave me alone in my room for hours. One of his favorites was to leave me in a dark room. What was in that room would vary. Sometimes there was nothing. Other times he soundproofed the walls. Once he even locked me in the bathtub filled with warm water. The water slowly cooled until I was shivering and balancing on the rim of the tub with my hands on the glass wall that was locked shut. Every few minutes I'd debate breaking the glass but feared an even worse follow-up punishment. Eventually the etiquette lessons ended and were replaced by requests for me to perform. The performances always varied. They could be dances, songs, reading of poetry or books, or lewd acts. Similar to our previous lessons. If I refused to cooperate or didn't perform to his liking, he would punish me. He would switch into my body, then dislocate his thumb, elbow, or something along those lines, and then force me back into that body to endure the consequences, all the while continuing the performance. One of the times he left me in my room with a broken finger or two. A storm came. I could hear the rain on the roof slowly build. I always liked hearing the pitter-patter. I found it calming and, in this hellhole, It was one of the few connections I had to the outside world. I remember one of the few lucid moments my mom had. She spent cuddling with me on a rainy day. I liked to hang on to that. The storm didn't remain a simple pitter-patter for long. It slowly built up and I could hear the thunder get closer. Soon the wind seemed to be tearing at the house. And I could see one of the boards on my window rattling. For a brief second, I caught a glimpse of the outside world when the end of the board lifted up enough. That was all the inspiration I needed. I grabbed the chair in the room and banged it as hard as I could against the window, avoiding the padlock on the frame. I broke through the paltry remaining glass, and repeatedly smashed into the loose board. The chair broke first. But eventually I snapped the board too. The sight took my breath away. I stared out over his backyard, filled with rusting vehicles. The overgrown lawn and woods surrounding the property looked very much the same as the first time and only time I saw them. I could actually picture freedom. That was enough to get me up onto the windowsill. Foolishly, I looked down before jumping, and suddenly felt dizzy from the height. The wind and the rain splashing over my face woke me up to my reality, and I quickly lost my nerve to commit. I stood there, staring down, knowing in the back of my head it was only a matter of time before my captor would notice what I had done if he hadn't already. I had to leave, but my body was frozen with fear. I had almost forgotten what it had felt like to be this afraid. Living with my captor had numbed me to so many different types of pain. Though I hadn't been confronted with such a concrete visceral threat since that first attack. Rationally, I knew I was only 15 feet up. Max. Rationally, I knew my chances of running out into the storm were much better than staying in this house. Rationally, I couldn't be afraid of something so normal after everything I'd been through. And yet I was. The storm continued to bless me. However, because while I was petrified and holding on to that ledge, lightning struck a tree out in the woods. Instantly, thunder immersed me. My whole consciousness focused on getting away from the sound and the light, which meant my body was no longer focused on gripping onto my precarious ledge. And I fell. All things considered, I landed pretty well. My form was awkward. I badly twisted my ankle. But I was grateful that was the worst of my injuries. I struggled to stand, and limped toward the road. If my memory served me right, there was another house a half-mile down the road. If I could make it there, I would be safe. A 10-minute hobble at worst. I could make it. Granted, that was 10 minutes he had to notice something was wrong and come after me. I didn't know how far away I had to be before he couldn't just swap us again. I didn't even know if he had a swapping range, so my first goal was reaching the road. I hoped that would be far enough. So I only focused on reaching it. To my surprise, I made it. I paused after stepping off his driveway, unsure of what to do next. Should I keep on the road and head toward the neighbor? Should I try keeping to the woods to make it harder for him to see me? Should I just hide? A million doubts were flying through my head with each possibility. But I knew I couldn't stay there to ponder. In the end, my twisted ankle decided things for me. I knew I wouldn't be able to move very fast in the woods. So I went for the straight shot. My foot was really bothering me. But I had learned to ignore and work through the pain. Suck on that, Mr. Douche Canoe. You taught me how to do that one. I remember thinking. I only made it about 30 feet before I fell. I stood up and held back puke as I realized everything was wrong. For one, my foot didn't hurt anymore. And for two, I wasn't standing on the road either. Knowing what was coming, I started sprinting. I didn't head towards the road again this time. Instead, I ran the other direction, back toward the house. 3 steps later, I flickered. It didn't affect me too much. And I barely broke stride as I continued my dash. My next swap lasted longer. I found myself back in my body with fire shooting up my leg. It gave out with the next step I took and I fell once again, covering myself with mud. Help me! I screamed. My chest heaved with the exertion. But I knew now the neighbors were my only hope. He's trying to kill. I only barely heard the scream before it cut off. The raging wind and rain masked my voice a little too well. Apparently, he was mid-run when he switched. And I struggled to keep my balance as I tried to stop my momentum toward the road. I only managed to turn around before I could hardly breathe. I gagged. My mouth was crammed full of mud. I sat there trying to spit it out and keep myself from heaving. Once I thought I had enough of it clear, I took a deep breath to start yelling again, only to sputter as chunks I missed flew into the back of my throat. Before I could spit any more out, we swapped again. This time I was prepared and could make the turn faster. I put some serious distance between myself and the road, though I didn't reach the previous swapping spot before I was shunted back once again. This time I couldn't stop my vomit. My hand was all the way back in my throat. I threw up around my hand, splashing bile onto the road below me. I could only barely stay up on my one hand and knees, even amid the fluids spewing from my mouth. I couldn't quite get my hand out. I panicked, afraid that I would choke on my own bile. To make things worse, anytime I tried to move my hand I felt sharp pangs in the wrist, and none of the fingers responded exactly how I expected. I was stuck in this wretched state until we swapped yet again. I could see myself now, heaving and gasping for air around the hand protruding out of my mouth. I knew running away wouldn't work anymore, so I dove to the ground. My self-preservation instincts saved me from most of the harm, but I think I got a good bruise or two in. He switched before I could do any more. I'd stopped heaving, but still had to work my hand out of my mouth. Looking back, I was lucky that my current punishment included skipping meals. My puke was mostly liquid. I forced out my hand and called out, albeit much weaker than earlier. The storm made it hard to hear anything, but damn if I wasn't going to at least try. I continued crawling, using my one good hand, stumbling on elbow and knees, dragging myself forward. Please, help. Another brief swap, ending with my face in the mud. I left him running towards a tree. Again, my other thumb stopped responding and now both hands hurt like hell. My face ached too. I dived onto a pile of sticks. Again, I could taste blood. Everything was hurting now. I'd kicked off his shoes and pants, hoping they'd get him tangled. Again, the pain was dulled this time, but I still tasted some faint metal. Then a throb and everything hurt so much all over again. I had tried punching himself in the head, but I think I just hurt his hand more than anything. I wanted to stand up, but everything seemed so sluggish. By the time I got back up to my forearms and knees I felt hands grasp my hair. I was viciously yanked back, my spine protesting the movement. Then my face slammed into the ground, and stars flooded my vision. He repeated the action. Again, and again, and again. I heard yells, but I couldn't make out anything other than raw hatred. Finally, I went limp, giving in to his whims as I tried to protect my body in what little way I could. Somehow, I made it back to my room afterward. I suppose it's a blessing I don't remember the crawl. I can only assume the amount of pain it entailed. The next few days were a blur. I remember feeling awful. I wasn't sure if it was due to more punishments or my concussion. Someone else was always in the room while I recovered. And strangely enough I was allowed to recover in peace. Or relative peace. I was still kidnapped after all. But I stayed in my body the whole time. Not even a flicker passed. Usually Benedict watched over me. By that I mean he sat in the corner staring off into the distance, lost in his own thoughts. I didn't mind. I wasn't really up for much conversation anyways, though I was bored as hell. Occasionally my captor would be there. With him, I couldn't get a moment of silence. He would alternate between berating me for trying to escape, and then lecture me on living up to the name Margaret. Sometimes, he would jump so suddenly between the two it was frightening. Both administered first aid, cleaning my wounds, applying splints, and administering drugs. Benedict did it all so mechanically. My captor as if I was his child. One day while Benedict was watching me, he broke from his norm and spoke. "He will kill you. You know." He all but blurted, still staring off into space. "Come again?" I asked. At first, I thought my captor had switched in and was messing with me. "He tries to keep us alive. But don't," he cut off abruptly, and held up one finger. My concussed brain took several seconds before it could process what he was doing. "I'm sorry. I'm really out of it. How many days was I unconscious?" "Ah. So it is Benedict." His eyes darted down to my fist, with my thumb in between my middle and ring fingers. 7 days. Don't worry about it," he replied. We then completed the signal before he continued. "He works hard to keep us healthy. Or, well, relatively healthy. But don't let that fool you. He will kill you. Eventually, nobody escapes from here. I could tell there was something in the tone of his voice. It was heavier than normal. Which was saying something considering how heavy our circumstances usually were. Benedict, he flinched at the mention of his name. Have you seen him kill someone? I prodded. Oh, you mean besides us? We're dead inside already. All that's left are our bodies. Benedict. I reprimanded, trying to emulate a stern schoolteacher. 2. He said after a pause. I've seen 2 others. Both dead at his hands. How did they die? I asked. The first, well, he killed himself. At least that's what he told me. I didn't personally witness that one. I barely knew the guy. He died shortly after I was brought here. We didn't have much face-to-face time. And the other? Well, she wanted to fight back. You remind me of her. Actually. She tried escaping. Hurting him. Etc. Of course. None of that really worked. But she never gave up. Then she decided to go on a hunger strike. That didn't really work either. He just kept putting her into a fed body. So her point was moot. But she must have sensed it annoyed him. Because she kept at it. Slowly. She stopped doing anything else. Either. I mean, she would literally lie there on the floor. And do nothing. He punished her. But that never stopped her. If anything. It only strengthened her cause. I think she saw how much she was pissing him off and thought she had earned some small victory. I don't know. I never got to ask her what she was doing. I can only hope she felt that victory was worth her life. He trailed off into silence again. So, she just wasted away. Lost her will to live and all? I asked. No. He killed her. Like I said. He was pissed about the whole thing. Once he realized his usual methods of punishment weren't working. He resorted to simple beatings. He beat the shit out of her. It was painful to watch. But he made me. 2 birds with 1 stone kind of thing. I guess. I was there when he just snapped and beat her until she was a bloody pulp. He left her body there for days. Slowly rotting. In the end. He made me deal with it. Another punishment for me, I suppose. He shrugged. Staring at the wall again. Oh. Wow. Were the only words that found their way to my mouth. I just wanted to remove any doubt that we're stuck in here. Or that he will let us live indefinitely. We all have an expiration date. Please just don't make me outlive you too. After that. He was silent. I didn't try to make him speak. Either. Just sat and thought about what he said. As my concussion started fading away. The flickers resumed. And my schedule became more erratic. My captor started giving me a sleeping pill every night. And soon I couldn't fall asleep on my own anymore. I suspected it wasn't a new practice. It was just the first time I got to take the pills myself. My healing break was ending. Once I had essentially returned to normal, or my new normal, as things were, my sessions continued. For the first one. My door flew open and the young man walked in. All right. Enough healing. He stated. Surprisingly casual for how hard the door opened. Let's make sure you learn a lesson from all this. Shall we? My heart raced. Was my beating not enough? Get up. I want that window open. Chop chop. I scrambled out of bed. He berated me as I beat against the new board he had installed. This one was much sturdier than the last. And he refused to give me anything to hit it with. So I wailed on it until my fists were bloody. Finally it gave. And I slumped. Exhausted. Oh. That's not all, young lady. He chided. Jump out. I stared at him but knew this was not a joke. At least for me it wasn't. He was probably laughing to himself about this. My body refused to move. However, it was different willingly jumping out a window when you knew you had no chance to escape. Then I saw the knife. I sat frozen as he tossed it towards me. And watched as my body caught it. He switched us mid-throw. He took the blade and sliced my leg. Not deep. But deep enough to be painful. He then tossed it back. And I found myself in my body again. Don't make me repeat myself. I clambered onto the windowsill. Looking outside once more. This time the yard was much calmer. With sunlight falling softly on my face and his overgrown weeds. The air was sweet. Laced with the scent of flowers on the wind. The world outside was at peace. I preferred the storm. Still. My body yielded to instinct. And I could not jump. I felt 2 strong hands push on my back and tumbled down to the ground below. My landing was less graceful than last time. But I didn't injure myself. I left the door unlocked. Get back here quickly. I hesitated. But after a brief shunt with him sticking my finger in my wound, I limped back into my room. I barely registered this was my first time freely moving through his house. Before I re-entered my room. Again. He instructed. I balked. But he walked me back to the sill and practically threw me out. This happened 12 more times. By the last few, I could no longer walk, and crawled back to my room each time. Once he was satisfied with my agony. He said, "Now I hope you recognize the consequences of your actions." Then he turned and left, locking the outside of my door in the process. I crawled back into bed and tried vainly to not bleed all over the mattress. He didn't give me any time to recover from my new injuries, and instead started sessions right away. Since my wounds prevented me from performing for the most part, he would have Benedict join me, and force us to act out scenes for him to watch. Sometimes, he would jump in himself, but mainly his intrusions would be criticisms or the ever-present flickers. We started small. At first, we had simple tea parties. Our captor provided us with some scripts, idle small talk about the weather which we could not see, or current events which seemed out of date. He continued to interrupt to correct my posture and etiquette, which made following the script frustrating. I often caught him mouthing my lines along with me. If it weren't for my circumstances, I would have laughed at seeing a middle-aged man getting so excited about phrases such as the weather is quite pleasant. Is it not? Even more off-putting was that sometimes Benedict didn't look at his script before speaking. I didn't know if that was because he had a great short-term memory, or if these scripts were reused that often. The latter ended up being the case. And after several repetitions of the scene, I had also memorized idle talk over tea. When our captor wasn't satisfied with our performance, he would switch us mid-sentence and carry on with the respect he believed he deserved. He wanted us to talk in proper British accents, and act genuinely interested in what the other had to say, even though none of it was relevant to us and I had heard the damn script dozens of times already. Strangely, he did not physically punish me much for making mistakes. I was thankful that I could rest my injuries, though still he took advantage of my recovery on the odd punishments. Now, if he was not satisfied with our reading, we were not allowed to leave the table until he was, or until we passed out from exhaustion. Passing out was the less acceptable option, and he made sure we knew it. Eventually, he was either satisfied with our act, or he grew tired of it. Either way, he allowed us to move on, and switch roles. While I did not know my partner's lines as well as mine, we made much quicker progress and shortly continued to his next version. This time, he had us perform in each other's bodies. Eventually we had been rotated through the scene playing with all sorts of combinations of different roles in different bodies. By the time he was satisfied with our work, I found myself muttering the lines in my sleep. More importantly, my injuries had healed well enough for me to walk again, albeit with a limp. He then passed us through a variety of different scenes and scenarios. Sometimes we acted as children playing with each other, other times a parent scolding their child. Sometimes we were old friends on a bench, others mortal enemies glaring at each other over lunch. They were all mundane scripts that we pored over, always shunting between different bodies and switching roles. I wouldn't say that we were great at acting, but we were emulating our captor's desires well enough. Gradually, the scenes became more interesting. Soon we were a knight rescuing a damsel in distress, or two lovers having a spat. Gender roles or other stereotypes were disregarded as we switched through the combinations of roles and bodies. At one point, he stopped giving us scripts, and would have us improvise whatever he wanted to watch for the day. Since not much else was going on, I tried to have fun with these and reclaim any sense of enjoyment. I threw myself into the roles, whether I was a dastardly villain or the valiant hero, and my life became somewhat bearable. It did not last long. One day, as the three of us gathered for the next session, our captor did not have any scripts for us. I had come to expect this by now and was looking forward to another fun play with Benedict. I stayed silent, waiting patiently for our captor to give us our roles. He studied us both carefully, before simply commanding, "Undress." At first, I thought I misheard him. But when I turned to Benedict, I saw him slowly removing his clothes. I stared open-mouthed in shock. He was carefully trying to avoid my gaze. I looked back at my captor and saw him staring expectantly at me. It had been one thing to perform lewd acts for him solo, but I had come to see Benedict as a friend. Besides, having someone else there made it real. Would we have to carry on as normal after this? I didn't want to think about it. And still don't. You'll have to forgive me for not going into much detail here, it's not a pleasant memory. Ultimately, he broke me as always. And I gave in? It suffices to say that this became a regular aspect in scenes moving forward. Not all, of course. Sometimes he became even more cruel and creative. But like all other scenes, the bodies and roles would rotate, making these experiences even more alien and uncomfortable for me. I can't say the same for the other two. Throughout all of this, I was becoming increasingly familiar with the other bodies. I learned their quirks. Like how one of Benedict's legs was longer than the other. Or how my captor's shoulder would click if I reached behind my head. My captor's mostly numb legs were no longer a shock. And I no longer tried to stand in his body. I could feel the different ways the muscles would stretch and knew their range of movement. I adapted to use the other sex's genitals. I could even order the three bodies by how long it would take them to fall asleep after being given our nightly sleeping pill. There were subtle differences too. For one, I realized my thinking changed with my body. On the surface, my habits adapted. I avoided objects that I banged into as Benedict, which would be too high for me to hit myself. I would only take paths that could fit a wheelchair as the old man. A little deeper, and I realized that as the old man, my thoughts would turn to domination. Whenever Benedict and I were in a competition, I wanted to win. I wanted to improve if possible. As Benedict's body, I would put things more into terms of survival. Often, I found my mind drifting elsewhere, trying to distract myself from the current circumstances. Even my emotions changed. My captor's emotions were duller than the others. Still there, but I typically didn't feel much extremes when in his body. I was, however, quicker to anger and embarrassment as him. Benedict, well, he just seemed much more frustrated. I felt that everything was getting in my way. Which, to be fair, things always were. He was much more hot-blooded, contrasting his relatively cool demeanor whenever we interacted. There was more going on with each body. A complex swirl of emotions and thoughts that at times would clash with my own way of thinking. No two emotion cocktails were the same, and it was difficult to discern exactly why I was feeling and or thinking the way I was. It took me years to become familiar with myself and understand my body as well as I did. I didn't have that time to devote to these others. At the same time, I found myself alone in these other bodies more often. Whereas in the beginning, I was always in my own body unless there was a special reason. Like my captor experimenting with it during those first few days. Or when I borrowed someone else's while he was starving me. I would draw my fingers across the scars and markings on each and wonder how they got them. Were any from their life before here? Would they even remember? I was surprised to find scars across the whole of my captor's body. He was as badly scarred as the rest of us. Though it made sense that he would punish us regardless of our body. In our more recent sessions, he didn't seem too attached to his body anyways. Which only led me to wonder why I was always in my own at the beginning. As I was becoming more familiar in these other bodies, my own was drifting away. Every time I hopped back into it, it seemed less and less my own. Like a pair of sneakers that someone else had borrowed for a while. They started to wear in places I wasn't used to. And it affected my gait. I was losing whatever ties I had to who I was before entering this house of horrors. I was losing myself. We were having one of our more innocent sessions at tea party. This time I was in the old man's body, while our captor watched in mine. The story was that Benedict had just come back from war to find that his mother had disappeared. But his father refused to talk about it. "I am back, Father," Benedict exclaimed, pretending to have just entered the room. "Oh, my dear boy. Please do come in," I responded, trying to act both excited and alarmed at his arrival. "Come closer. Let me have a good look at you," I continued, as he neared. I touched his face and said, "Oh son, I feel we must celebrate such a momentous occasion. I have the finest tea. Let us partake." I glanced at my captor, hoping the transition to his desired tea party was not too forced. He always liked to keep the scene moving, but despised rushed excuses. I wanted to get through his dramatic interrogation scene quickly so I could return to my lonesome. These scenes only grated my nerves nowadays, something I'm sure my captor knew about, since the scenes had been growing more tedious every session. His face betrayed no displeasure, and so I moved to wheel myself toward the cabinet containing the tea supplies. Benedict put his hand on my shoulder to stop me. "Father," Benedict chided, "your doctor told me that you should not be exerting yourself. Let me." While I acted annoyed and grumbled about my growing dependence on others, inwardly I was grateful. I really didn't want to have to fumble around on the stove making tea, straining so that I could reach the kettle on the back stovetop. I assumed our captor's insistence on using that burner was just another small punishment we had to endure. "How have you been?" he asked, after putting the kettle on. "I have been quite well, thank you," I responded. "How has the return been treating you?" I had decided that I was going to redirect the conversation anytime I thought it was heading towards the mysteriously missing mother. "It has been difficult, I will admit. The calm does not feel natural." He looked around. "Speaking of calm, is mother out shopping? I'd like to see her too. I have heard stories from other soldiers that they look for danger where there isn't any. Has that been happening to you?" I hope the sudden redirection mixed with an incredibly vague threat satisfied my captor. "Not quite. But I find the war leaking into my dreams." "Oh. I hear there is medicine that can help with that. I'll get you some next time I'm at the store." After all, fathers are meant to solve their sons' problems. He smirked at that line. "Well, if mother is already out, why not give the store a ring and have her pick it up there?" Touch. Benedict scored some points there for sure. In all due time. "Are the dreams really that terrible?" I stalled. I did not want to scare you, but sometimes I wake up screaming. "If there is medicine that would help, I am desperate to use it." "Oh, how horrible!" I exclaimed. "Well, if that is the case, then we really must ring the doctor for help. Did the military give you resources for this? I assume you cannot be alone in your dilemma." "Father." He looked me straight in the eye. "Where is mother? Please do not change the subject." "Boy, this is serious," I asked, trying to build into a rage. We sat in silence after that outburst, glaring at each other. The whistle from the tea kettle broke our stalemate, and Benedict begrudgingly stood up. He fixed the tea and brought it back to the table, giving the customary third cup to our spectator. I slowly dropped in a sugar cube as I tried to think of my next response. Surprisingly, instead of pushing me while I was already on the ropes, Benedict copied me. We stirred our teas in sync, while our captor sipped his as he waited for our next moves. "How was the tea in the military? Did you drink much of it while on the march?" I asked. "What?" Benedict asked, sharply looking up from his cup. "Oh, yes. It was our main source of warmth when we weren't at our fire. To tell the truth, I didn't even notice the taste. Just the feeling it gave me. I'm sure it wasn't ever as nice as this though." He gave me a small smile. "Let us savor this cup together. Shall we? It has been too long since I had fine tea in company who could enjoy it." We lifted our cups together and took a slow draw from the dark liquid. Our captor couldn't help but to join in as well. It was a rare, serene moment in the house. I had finally come to appreciate tea. Not because of its taste, of course, to me it still tasted like boiled leaves, but because it did give us a few seconds of peace. "Ah. Refreshing." Benedict sighed, breaking the spell. "Tell me, Father," he continued, "how have you kept busy since I have been gone? I must imagine things have been lonely." "I wouldn't say so," I replied. "I keep busy with my books, and with news of the world. I have been closely following the war. As any father, I do worry about my son. But haven't you anyone to share that news with?" He countered. I saw what he was doing. Either I must lie and bring up his mother, or I must tell the truth and admit I'm alone. I could see Benedict's extra experience in these scenes shining. "Oh well, of course. I talked to all the other worried parents. It seems impossible to talk to anybody in town without bringing up the war. How much longer do you think we will be fighting?" We continued our small talk cat and mouse game for several minutes. I found myself fighting to stay awake as the conversation got more and more exhausting. I was in the middle of a yawn when Benedict quietly said, "You know, Father, I really do not care what you have done to Mother. That biatch caused this household nothing but trouble. I am truly happy she is gone. My eyes shot wide open. What did he think he was doing? I glanced over at our captor and was shocked to see that he did not respond in the slightest. In fact, he was swaying in his seat until one of his arms gave out and he fell limp onto the table. At this, Benedict shot up and ran to the kitchen, fumbling around in the drawers. I looked between the pair, dumbstruck. Benedict found what he was looking for, the letter opener we last used when I found out my spouse had been killed in another scene. He ran back to the table and propped our captor back up. "Look, I don't know how much time I have," he said as he pulled the letter opener up to their eye. "I need you to promise me something. If you wake up first, you've got to kill me too." What was he saying? My head reeled. Why would I be killing anyone? I'll do the same. It's the only way we can ensure that he won't be walking out of here alive. He seemed so insistent in everything he was saying. But I could barely pay attention. "Hey, look at me. You have to kill me. Okay. That's your only shot. Got it?" He paused only to swallow a bit. "Don't worry about me. I've lived much longer than I deserved anyways. Look at me. I need to hear you say you'll do it." I hadn't realized my eyes had drifted closed. But I forced myself to look back at him. His eyes were boring into me, forcing me to stay alert. Somehow in the mix of things, the words "I will" slipped out of my mouth. His face softened. "And look, I'm sorry. I really am. But I needed to be strong enough to do it. And the sleeping pills always affected you the fastest." With horror I watched as he then drove the letter opener deep into my eye. I expected to be overcome with pain, but remembered I was still in the wheelchair. It's a bizarre thing, watching your own body die. Seeing somebody else in my body was weird to begin with, but I always expected to be shoved back inside at any moment. This felt like a dream, one of those which you watched yourself in third person. Except here, when you see yourself die, you don't wake up in your nice and safe bed. Instead you keep watching your death thralls. There was the natural urge to fight it. The belief that with enough willpower I wouldn't die. That I could push through my sleepy veil and revive my corpse. Of course that was impossible. But my brain was not prepared for this scenario. Whose is? I thrashed violently against the wheelchair in sympathy with my body. After what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to stop. It was then that I noticed a terrible wailing and felt my throat scrape against itself. Belatedly I put the two senses together and realized I was screaming. After a couple of seconds my screaming stopped. But I still sat transfixed. I couldn't look away from my own corpse. Then I saw the movement. And remembered Benedict. He looked to me and raised one finger. Automatically, I completed his signal. My previous screams shifted into unnatural laughter. We were free. He did it. The nightmare was over. "Let's get out of here. Shall we?" he asked, gesturing for the door. I wheeled away from the table as the room blurred from my tears. My body was gone. But it was a worthwhile sacrifice to leave this madman's lair. Now to scrape together a new life to match my new body. As I reached the threshold of the kitchen, I flickered. Maniacal laughter erupted from the man in the wheelchair. He stretched his muscles like a convulsing contortionist, all the while continuing his inhuman laugh. He finished his bizarre motions and turned around to face me. He began, interrupting himself with another fit of giggles. "I will destroy you." He forced the words out between intermittent grunts, squeaks, and other bodily noises. I felt my back slam violently into the wheelchair, and I stared back at the younger man's body. "But you already knew that, didn't you?" he said, not waiting to hear an answer. "Benedict told you that himself. But you didn't believe him. How foolish to think you could leave." I sat completely still, not daring to provoke him any further. His normal facade of composure had cracked. And to be frank, the man already was unhinged. Anyways, I was still trying to figure out what was happening. He spat on the ground. "Though your ignorance is but a pithy pothole compared to Benedict's canyon of stupidity," he continued. "Did that nimwit really believe he could kill me? Me? He had seen exactly what happened to those who tried. And now he's gone and wasted a perfectly good body. I wasn't anywhere near done with her. A ducking waste. I must give him due credit. Though, this all turned out very interesting. Much better than anything I could have thought up. Hope has a habit of doing so. He always was good at that. He dug himself out of his thoughts and raised his eyes back to me. Well, I guess he lived up to his name after all. I'm the fool for not seeing he'd turn on me. But you must understand he was incredibly useful up until now. I guess you'll now have to provide all the fun on your own. I didn't like the mischievous smile growing on his face. No use in having her be a complete waste. Set her back up. Let's finish the scene. Something about a biatch causing trouble. If I recall. After I fumbled my way through the scene. He locked me in the bloodied kitchen with my body. He utilized it for various forms of psychological torture until it was no longer practical. Then he made me dispose of it myself and rewarded me with a fancy pork chop dinner. The days afterwards were especially hard. All his attention was focused on me. And he vented his anger from Benedict's death accordingly. I myself was an empty husk of a person. Torn between grieving for a lost friend, questioning the circumstances of his death, and rethinking all of our previous interactions. It was all I could do to survive my new circumstances. I complied with any and every request my captor gave, not because I feared the repercussions of refusing, but merely because I had lost all reason to do otherwise. It was easier to go along, because that meant no more thinking on my part. Sometimes I'd forget what happened. Those were my happiest moments. I'd see my captor recreate one of Benedict's mannerisms and believe that he was still alive. For just 1 second he was still trying to help me out. Then the illusion would shatter. And I'd remember he was just a shell with a monster as his puppeteer. Of course my captor didn't help things once he realized what was happening. On the contrary, he started acting more like Benedict on purpose just to get a rise out of me. Eventually things subsided. And I was given more and more time in isolation. Not that it mattered much to me. My black depression had consumed all. Now that I think of it, he didn't even bother to lock me in every night. Though he never failed to make sure I was locked before he left the house or interacted with anybody from outside. He was wrong to do that. I wouldn't have gone anywhere anyways. I had another long span of isolation before he broke from our routine again. If you can even call it that. I hadn't bothered to count how many days since I last saw him. I was more than content with my store of rations and chamber pot. Not that I ate much. Anyways. My solitude was interrupted by the routine body swap. As I stood patiently outside my own door waiting for my captor to unlock it and come out, something felt off with my body. I counted my fingers and checked my hands and arms for any new wounds or scars. Nothing. I was halfway through counting my toes when it hit me. I was standing. This body wasn't shackled to a wheelchair. I quickly felt up and down my new body trying to make sense of things and discovered I was a woman again. My exploration was cut short when my captor emerged. After a flicker between bodies, he smirked at me from Benedict's. "Ah. I thought you might like that," he said. "It suits you." I hadn't even realized I was smiling myself when he said that. Guilt flooded in. Still, I could not stop feeling vaguely elated at being back in a body of my own sex. He bade me to follow him. And so I did. Marveling at this new body while discovering its quirks on my walk to the basement. Only when he opened the door and I saw the wheelchair body bound and gagged did I wonder whose body I inhabited. They stared at our entrance wide-eyed. And tried to scream or beg through their gag. I couldn't tell which. I practically smelled the fear emanating from them. That fear resonated with my body. And though I personally had grown numb to the uncertainty of this house, my body began to shake by itself. This prompted a bout of empathy. I remembered being in their shoes and Benedict was in mine. How funny that his soul was gone while his body stood right next to my own. Or next to the one I was borrowing. Suddenly I felt numb again. I welcomed the emptiness this time. It was a nice respite from the whirlwind of emotions that had been flowing through me. Though I relished this familiar bleakness, I'd ignored the reason for it. I was back in Benedict's body. The woman walked toward me. When she lifted her hand, I saw it held a gun. Where did she get a gun? Weird. How that was my first thought. Long ago I had given up on trying to understand this house. But still that unnerved me. How had I missed it? A split second later, as the gun came to point squarely at my face, a new thought replaced it. Wait. Is she going to shoot me? I stood transfixed with fear. Whereas only a few minutes earlier I did not care about anything. And death seemed a distant friend. Now it was a loathed enemy. Still, my body could not move. And the only conscious thought I could force myself to hold was why. In answer, everything changed. For a brief moment, I felt a heavy weight in my hand. Then it disappeared and was replaced with the biting of rope around my wrists and ankles. I stared as the new body pointed the gun at Benedict's husk. "Margaret, it's time to say goodbye," he said. A deafening crack filled the room and blood spurted from Benedict's shattered head. He fell to the ground and I sat helpless as yet another body I'd inhabited was no more. They say you die twice. Once when your body passes, and twice the last time someone utters your name. Though in these hellish halls, that saying twists and distorts. I never knew Benedict's real name, nor did I know anything about him outside of our interactions in this prison. But now I've seen his death twice already and felt him gone completely. I died once already. Who knew when my second would come? My captor removed my bounds and resat me in the wheelchair before shunting me into the new body. He had me dispose of Benedict's corpse. Then he left without another word. He locked the door this time. I was left to my own thoughts. Though the fact that I had thoughts beyond eating and sleeping was surprising in and of itself. My depression was still there. So I only thought numbly on Benedict and reflected on my brief time in the new body. The latter excited me. I'd long ago become accustomed to the three bodies in this house, and changing between them was commonplace. But this body was different. It seemed green, raw even. I tasted fresh fear, different from the ever-present emotion I had learned to cope with. The longer I sat in that room, the more the wheelchair grated on me, and the more I craved being in that other body, the one which so closely resembled my lost body. It's difficult to explain why it was so familiar. We looked nothing alike. She was both older and larger than me. I wouldn't have given her a second glance if we passed each other on the street. And yet when I walked in her body, it seemed natural. Much more natural than Benedict's shuffle, let alone the wheelchair. Of course, being in a woman's body probably accounted for most of it. The movement of the hips, the balance of the body, and even the way her unshaved legs caught at the fabric of her pants reminded me of my own. There were several glaring differences, but at the time I was wrapping myself in a blanket of nostalgia and deliberately overlooking those. Sometime later I heard the front door open and close, accompanied by a muffled voice. I could barely contain my excitement to re-inhabit the new body. But something tickled the back of my head, an unnerving thought that I couldn't quite voice. As he ascended the stairs and drew closer to my room, it clicked. Who is he talking to? I sat poised for something to happen. At any moment I would hear the lock click open, and my captor would make some demand. Or I would find myself pushed out into another body. Either that woman's body I so craved, or maybe even the newcomer's. I looked forward to complying, no matter what happened. But the footsteps paused at the room next to mine. And that door was the one which opened and closed. Still, I kept my hopes up for a transfer. I rolled over to put my ear up against the wall. "Now see. This is a very special house." A woman's voice cooed. "What happens here doesn't happen anywhere else in the world. That's why I brought you here. To make you stronger. To make you better." "But mommy, I'm scared." I froze. That was the voice of a little girl. A terrified little girl. He brought a little girl into this house. Horror washed over me, quickly replaced by self-disgust. That body I had been obsessing over belonged to this girl's mother. I was thinking only of myself. While I wallowed over how much I missed my own body, I never stopped to think who originally occupied that object of my desires. No. Instead, she was just a piece of meat that, if I was lucky, I could play with for a bit. And she was dead. I realized. He killed her while I watched. I had mourned the death of an empty husk instead of the very soul extinguished in front of me. The words I heard on the other side of the wall only further fueled the anger burning inside me. "Oh no. Darling." The woman cooed. "You're not really scared." "Not yet. Anyways. But be brave for mommy. Okay. You have to be stronger to see daddy again. He doesn't want to see you if you're still this pathetic. Now, are you ready to face your demons? Sweetie." "Mommy. Please no." The child begged on the other side. "I want to go home." I heard sobbing. I banged on the wall. "Stop this." I screamed. "Don't you dare hurt her. Take anyone else. Hurt me. Please. But not her." "See?" My captor said. "It's coming. You can't stop it. You need this, darling. This is what your parents want for you." The crying stopped. And after a few seconds of silence in the other room, the child spoke up. "Now fight them," she said. Other sounds joined my pounding, as I heard a body hit the floor and what sounded like a scuffle. The woman was screaming now. Her screams were punctuated by sickening thuds and cracks. Eventually the sounds subsided. I grew tired of bloodying my fists against the wall. Tears rolled down my eyes. I knew I was helpless in this house, but never realized exactly how powerless I was. I heard the other door open and something heavy dragged along the floor. Soon my door opened as well, and I saw her for the first time. She was young, no older than 10. Her tangled hair reached down to her neck but didn't touch her shoulders. Her pink overalls were stained with blood, with more splattered across her face and arms. Yet she looked exhausted, not harmed. Behind her, she was dragging a bloody broken mess. It took me a second to recognize it as the woman, her mother. My captor still held the bloodied baseball bat, the one I last saw when I was attacked. She stopped as the body reached the bed and looked up at me with blue eyes filled with excitement and entirely devoid of innocence. She spat out, "Are we putting her on the bed? Or would you rather nurse her on the floor?" My anger seethed, but I knew the pain I'd endured myself, and wanted to give her what little comforts I could. So we lifted her, awkwardly as I couldn't move my legs, and my captor was now a small little thing. She left and then came back with food, water, a first aid kit, and other supplies we would need. Together we bandaged her up, and my captor made sure she was stable. She quickly lectured me on what I needed to do, replacing bandages, turning her, and whatnot. Once her work was done, she turned to me and said, "Now, if you want to use that new body ever again, you'll have to earn it. I trust you know what to do." She read me correctly, and her smugness reflected that. When I didn't reply, she nodded very well, and left, locking us in as she went to do whatever it was she did with new bodies. I watched over the woman's body, as Benedict did to me. I thought over what he'd said to me on my first day, how he tried to explain my circumstances. How do I convey that to a child? I thought. It was hard enough for me to come to terms with it. Anything I said could be overwritten by our captor. He had control of her body, and evidently had groomed her for capture. The only thing I could really do was comfort her and try to keep her pain to a minimum. What helped me the most was having someone else with me. I remembered the signal Benedict shared with me, and how we used it for brief exchanges, though in the end our captor knew it, and probably had known it the whole time. Was that what he wanted from me? No. I refused. It's one thing to do it just to survive, but it's another to inflict that on a child. Benedict's question interrupted my stream of thoughts. "You aren't feeling suicidal or anything, are you?" I waited for several minutes. No flickers. It was just like that first day, where I had actual privacy. Benedict, or whatever his real name was telling the truth about that. I reached for the pillow. Something in the back of my head said I had to protect this girl at all costs. I couldn't do that here. There was no way I could save her from this madness and give her back a normal life. But I could spare her the pain, and end it right now. I pulled the pillow over her face and braced myself. Sometime later I heard the front door open and close, accompanied by a muffled voice. I could barely contain my excitement to re-inhabit the new body, but something tickled the back of my head, an unnerving thought that I couldn't quite voice. As he ascended the stairs and drew closer to my room, it clicked. Who is he talking to? I sat poised for something to happen. At any moment I would hear the lock click open, and my captor would make some demand, or I would find myself pushed out into another body. Either that woman's body I so craved, or maybe even the newcomer's. I looked forward to complying, no matter what happened. But the footsteps paused at the room next to mine, and that door was the one which opened and closed. Still, I kept my hopes up for a transfer. I rolled over to put my ear up against the wall. "Now see, this is a very special house," a woman's voice cooed. "What happens here doesn't happen anywhere else in the world. That's why I brought you here. To make you stronger. To make you better. But mommy, I'm scared." I froze. That was the voice of a little girl. A terrified little girl. He brought a little girl into this house. Horror washed over me, quickly replaced by self-disgust. That body I had been obsessing over belonged to this girl's mother. I was thinking only of myself. While I wallowed over how much I missed my own body, I never stopped to think who originally occupied that object of my desires. No. Instead, she was just a piece of meat that, if I was lucky, I could play with for a bit. And she was dead. I realized. He killed her while I watched. I had mourned the death of an empty husk instead of the very soul extinguished in front of me. The words I heard on the other side of the wall only further fueled the anger burning inside me. "Oh no. Darling." The woman cooed. "You're not really scared?" "Not yet. Anyways. But be brave for mommy. Okay. You have to be stronger to see daddy again. He doesn't want to see you if you're still this pathetic. Now, are you ready to face your demons? Sweetie. Mommy. Please no." The child begged on the other side, "I want to go home." I heard sobbing. I banged on the wall. "Stop this." I screamed, "Don't you dare hurt her. Take anyone else. Hurt me. Please. But not her." "See?" My captor said. "It's coming. You can't stop it. You need this, darling. This is what your parents want for you." The crying stopped. And after a few seconds of silence in the other room, the child spoke up. "Now fight them," she said. Other sounds joined my pounding, as I heard a body hit the floor and what sounded like a scuffle. The woman was screaming now. Her screams were punctuated by sickening thuds and cracks. Eventually the sounds subsided. I grew tired of bloodying my fists against the wall. Tears rolled down my eyes. I knew I was helpless in this house, but never realized exactly how powerless I was. I heard the other door open and something heavy dragged along the floor. Soon my door opened as well, and I saw her for the first time. She was young, no older than 10. Her tangled hair reached down to her neck but didn't touch her shoulders. Her pink overalls were stained with blood, with more splattered across her face and arms. Yet she looked exhausted, not harmed. Behind her, she was dragging a bloody broken mess. It took me a second to recognize it as the woman, her mother. My captor still held the bloodied baseball bat, the one I last saw when I was attacked. She stopped as the body reached the bed and looked up at me with blue eyes filled with excitement and entirely devoid of innocence. She spat out, "Are we putting her on the bed? Or would you rather nurse her on the floor?" My anger seethed, but I knew the pain I'd endured myself, and wanted to give her what little comforts I could. So we lifted her, awkwardly as I couldn't move my legs, and my captor was now a small little thing. She left and then came back with food, water, a first aid kit, and other supplies we would need. Together we bandaged her up, and my captor made sure she was stable. She quickly lectured me on what I needed to do, replacing bandages, turning her, and whatnot. Once her work was done, she turned to me and said, "Now, if you want to use that new body ever again, you'll have to earn it. I trust you know what to do." She read me correctly, and her smugness reflected that. When I didn't reply, she nodded very well, and left, locking us in as she went to do whatever it was she did with new bodies. I watched over the woman's body, as Benedict did to me. I thought over what he'd said to me on my first day. How he tried to explain my circumstances. How do I convey that to a child? I thought. It was hard enough for me to come to terms with it. Anything I said could be overwritten by our captor. He had control of her body, and evidently had groomed her for capture. The only thing I could really do was comfort her and try to keep her pain to a minimum. What helped me the most was having someone else with me. I remembered the signal Benedict shared with me, and how we used it for brief exchanges. Though in the end our captor knew it, and probably had known it the whole time. Was that what he wanted from me? No. I refused. It's one thing to do it just to survive, but it's another to inflict that on a child. Benedict's question interrupted my stream of thoughts. "You aren't feeling suicidal or anything, are you?" I waited for several minutes. No flickers. It was just like that first day, where I had actual privacy. Benedict, or whatever his real name was telling the truth about that. I reached for the pillow. Something in the back of my head said I had to protect this girl at all costs. I couldn't do that here. There was no way I could save her from this madness and give her back a normal life. But I could spare her the pain, and end it right now. I pulled the pillow over her face and braced myself. Couldn't do it. I thought mercy killing her was the right thing to do, but having never taken a life before, I couldn't bring myself to follow through. I dropped the pillow from above her face and wept. I felt hopeless. I dwelled on what life would look like from here on out, with my only solace being a familiar feeling body. With that thought on my mind, I searched the room for a way to end things for myself. I tried to get creative with the medical supplies. But still that thought intruded on the back of my mind. That I must protect her. Must save her from as much harm as I could. I had to risk it. I had nothing to lose. Nothing could be worse than knowing I didn't even try. I scanned the room for something useful. I found the bloody bat. Absently discarded under the bed. I fell to the floor to pick it up and pulled myself back into my wheelchair. Already I was breathless and coughing from that minor exertion. The body really was not treated well. Still, I had too much work ahead of me and couldn't afford to rest. I paused to see if my captor reacted to my movement. She did not. With the bat in hand, I rolled over to the window and bashed it as hard as I could. It didn't budge. I had broken this window open twice already, once during the storm, and again when he punished me for my escape attempt. That second time I had pried the fresh boards with my bare hands. This time I had two advantages. First, I had a bat. But more importantly, he made me place these boards here myself. And I knew there was no way I did a better job than my captor in nailing up that goddamn window. So even though the old man's body was much weaker and every strike jarred my body, I continued. I was too far committed to stop. If my captor caught me, she'd know what I was up to. So, I bashed again and again. Eventually the corner popped out. With it I turned the bat around and pried the rest of the boards off. It was awkward work. The whole time I waited for the flicker which would seal my fate. It didn't come. Luck was on my side. Finally, with the window free, I climbed out and tossed the wheelchair out in front of me. Here was my captor's second mistake. He thought that by putting me in this old man's body I was helpless. That I had no way of getting off the second floor of the house. But he had forced me to make this jump so many times before, that the numbness in my legs was a godsend. I hopped off, crawled back into my wheelchair, and rolled away as fast as I could. I rolled for several miles that evening, trying to put as much distance between me and that nightmare as I could. I begged, stole, and lied my way back to the closest major city, catching buses and hitchhiking when I could, rolling when I could not. I only stopped when I felt so swallowed by the crowd that nobody gave a poor old man in a battered wheelchair a second glance. Benedict was wrong. We could have escaped that very first day. I would have left my body with a madman. But I could have been free. That brings me to now. I escaped and survived in a city with no clue whose body I was inhabiting. I scrounged on the streets and used shelters when I could. But most importantly, I read. I begged my way into the local library where I used their computers and checked out their books. That's where I've been writing this story actually. I left that house by making a promise. I will save that girl. I've thought too many times about what she must be going through right now and how I failed her. I couldn't stop the pain from coming to her. But maybe I can stop it now. And maybe I can stop it from coming to anyone else. Benedict said nobody entered that house without our captor's permission. I want to prove him wrong one last time. In my time here I've learned just enough that I think I should be able to build a bomb. I've scraped enough money together that I should be able to get back to that house. Hopefully, I can take him out, and any other body he might be able to swap into to avoid the blast. At the very least my own pain will be over. I died the moment I entered that house. All that's left is for me to follow through. I also picked up a little bit of coding while I was here. I don't want to alert him to what I plan, so I've automated these past few posts, including this one. By the time you're reading this, I've either been captured or I'm dead. Probably have been for a couple of days. I added some code that will scan the local newspaper. I've put in a few keywords like explosion, bomb, etc. If it finds an article which matches the place time, then I set it to automatically attach to the bottom of this post, and then submit it for me. Can't guarantee it'll work, but it should give you some idea of what happened. Promise me that if I fail, someone will pick up my cause. People know monsters like him do not deserve to exist in this world. Searched 1,259 articles. Found one match. Printing article 1 of One Little Girl Sole Survivor in Farmhouse Explosion. By Tamara Fieldstone, editor, updated today. Posted May 1st, 2021. Tenerton, late last night. A fatal explosion claimed 2 lives and shocked the rural community. The explosion occurred sometime around 11 p.m. last night and decimated the property of a Mr. Albert Jones. Emergency services arrived 40 minutes later to find 7-year-old Lainey Anderson next to the burning house. Apparently, she and her mother, Kate Anderson, had been living with Jones for the past month or so. Both Kate Anderson and Jones were found dead inside the house. Authorities are asking for help identifying Lainey's remaining family. She is currently receiving medical care. For the burns received, authorities are still investigating the cause of the explosion but believe it to be due to a gas leak. Don Humphrey, Mr. Jones's closest neighbor, heard the blast from half a mile away and described the experience as, end of article preview.